The reason we've never gotten any sort of follow-up to the Urbz is probably just because the original kinda sucked. What is up, everybody? Dusty here with a follow-up to my video on the Urbz Sims in the City. Now, if you watched that video, then you know that I was not a fan of that game in the slightest, as I thought it was a buggy, borderline broken, and worst of all, boring mess that offers little value these days unless you're just looking for a quick hit of some early 2000s nostalgia. But to my surprise, the fan base didn't tear me a new one for expressing this opinion. Instead, one of the most common comments was just people noting how different the console version was from its handheld siblings. Now, I have to admit that despite being a pretty big fan of the series, the handheld entries are a major blind spot for me. In fact, most handheld games are a blind spot for me, despite having owned both a Game Boy Advance SP and DS when each was still relevant. See, aside from birthdays and Christmas gifts and the occasional title that my dad really just bought for himself, like a lot of kids, most of the games that I acquired throughout my childhood were purchased with my own money. And when you compare the handheld version of most games to their console counterparts, it usually just seemed like a better idea to save up the extra $10 or $20. I mean, just look at Spider-Man 2. The console game was one of the most beloved movie tie-ins of its era, while the GBA version doesn't look all that much more impressive than stuff like Separation Anxiety I'd already played on my family's old Super Nintendo. However, there were a few instances where the handheld version of a game ended up being the definitive edition, and with many of you claiming that's the case with the Urbz, I thought it'd be fun to check it out and find out for myself. Now, I'll be taking a look back at the DS version specifically, and while it does apparently add on a few extra bells and whistles, it's essentially just a slightly enhanced version of the GBA game, so most of what I say should apply to both. Anyway, once you've finished messing around with the limited customization options and have put the finishing touches on your Urbz, you're met with a stylish little opening sequence which lays out your character's current situation. And just like in the console version, you start off as a lowly nobody who's looking to make their name in the big city. However, that's where the similarities between the two begin and end, as it only takes about 10 minutes with the handheld version of the Urbz to realize it's offering up a very different experience than its console counterpart. Now, one of my biggest complaints with the console version of the Urbz was that Maxis never really seemed to lock in on why they were actually making the game or who it was supposed to be for. It lacked the freedom and unscripted antics to appeal to most fans of the series, while its abstract concept of a story and directionless gameplay did little to win over newcomers. The DS rendition of the Urbz, on the other hand, knew exactly what it wanted to be, and what it wanted to be was an absolutely batshit insane old-school adventure game. Now, don't get it twisted, it's not as though developer Kryptonite Games completely abandoned the classic Sims formula. The core gameplay loop of maintaining your Sims' needs in order to ensure they stay happy enough to actually be productive is still here, and considering that when you break it all down, this really just consists of making sure a bunch of meters stay green, I probably shouldn't have been so surprised to discover just how well it translated to handhelds. And while the game understandably lacks a build mode, there are still houses which can be purchased and furnished, and every couple of days you're hit with a stack of bills which need to be paid off, so any series veterans should feel right at home. But like I said, here, instead of comprising the entirety of the experience, Kryptonite uses that formula as the framework to build an old-school adventure game around, and it proves itself to be a winning combination, as having to keep your Urbz happy adds on an additional challenge. Yes, it is slightly annoying when your conversation comes to a dead stop because your character has the bladder control of a newborn kitten, but optimizing your character's time management skills in order to get the most out of their schedule has always been one of my favorite aspects of these games. And that loop also just ensures that the player consistently has a clear goal in sight at all times, which is something that the adventure genre has historically struggled with. And while all of the unpredictable, unscripted interactions between NPCs that make the main game so replayable naturally had to be cut out, Kryptonite did their best to approximate those elements as much as possible, given the limitations of the hardware. Your appliances frequently break down and require the occasional bit of maintenance, and until you fully upgraded your security system, your home is at risk of being robbed, and with Detective Dan DeMann seemingly being the only form of law enforcement in Minneapolis, the crime rate is absolutely ridiculous. A few days after moving into my first place, a burglar broke in and stole my toilet of all things, and it was weeks before the convenience store had one in stock, so in the meantime, I was forced to dart over to a comedy club every time I had to use the little boys' room. Now, the game's laid out in a way that is kinda similar to busting out in the original Sims on consoles, as progressing through the game requires players to finish missions, and each mission is comprised of a number of smaller objectives, which all have to be completed before you can advance. However, the various goals all directly tie into the story much more heavily than they had in those games, and what a batshit insane story does it turn out to be. During the course of events, you'll spend a night in jail, partake in identity theft, test your fiddling skills against a PG-friendly version of the devil, get kidnapped by a ninja, and even be a victim of attempted murder. When I said this game was batshit insane, I absolutely meant it. I mean, Daddy Big Buck's whole evil scheme is to just go back in time so that he can stake a claim to all the land in Minneapolis and convert it into an amusement park. But not like an actual amusement park, he just plans on replacing every building in town with exact replicas, except they'll all have ticket windows so they can charge admission fees to enter them. And that should tell you everything you need to know about the tone Kryptonite was going for. It's extremely lighthearted and doesn't take itself seriously in the least. The game runs on pure cartoon logic, and as long as you're willing to embrace that and you've got a soft spot for offbeat humor, then it's easy enough to have a good time. And I have to point out that all of the jobs here that you can participate in are actually represented by their own unique mini-games. I know that doesn't sound all that impressive, and unless you just got a really big soft spot for the original Excitebike or Simon Says, you probably won't be blown away by any of the offerings, but after suffering through the console version of the Urbz, I'd just like to give Kryptonite credit for actually putting some effort into these. However, while the Urbz might be superior to its console counterpart in essentially every way, it still has one major flaw, which is that the game does include a good bit of filler to pad out the runtime. The most common instances of this are the two goals where you either have to earn a certain amount of money to fund some harebrained scheme or raise your reputation. Now, saving up your simoleons should be pretty self-explanatory, but your reputation is essentially the city's collective opinion of you, so in order to raise it, you have to get in the good graces with as many of the locals as possible, which means that there are multiple occasions where you just have to run around harassing everybody you come across until you can actually trigger the next story event. And while the characters do have some pretty funny dialogue, it doesn't take too long before they start repeating their lines, and when that happens, you'll inevitably start to shut your brain off and just button mash your way through conversations. That being said, I'm also fully willing to admit that I probably didn't experience the Urbz on DS under ideal circumstances. I have to imagine that most play sessions with the Urbz back in the day took place during car rides or bus trips, and that playing through the game in 20 to 30 minute bursts over the course of a few weeks or months as intended would have masked a lot of the issues that arose when I was burning through the game in 3 days. However, the section we're running becomes illegal and results in Detective Dan DeMann hauling your ass down to the big house just completely sucks ass, and I'll hear no attempts to defend it. It's not like it's a fun little challenge, and it doesn't do anything except artificially extend the length of the game. And personally speaking, holding down a game's run button is just part of my muscle memory by this point, and not even boosting the game's speed through the magic of emulation was able to get me to break this habit. But even with those complaints, I still ultimately enjoyed my time with the Urbz on the DS. I don't think that's an essential Sims experience or anything, but considering that the series hasn't taken too many risks over the past decade or so, I'd say it's definitely worth checking out for those looking for a new twist on a formula they might become overly familiar with. I give the Urbz for the Nintendo DS 9 jaunty little murders jigs out of 12. Hey everybody, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you didn't, then I have no idea why I'd still be here by this point, but whatever, you do you. However, if you did enjoy it, then why not leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel so that you can be kept up to date with all my latest content. Or don't, don't let me tell you how to live your life. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching, I'm out.